Hi everyone, thank you for joining me to explore free cut piecing. My name is Mary Badges and I've been doing free cut piecing for 20 years and I'm still learning how to do it. The first thing to do to get started is to make sure your rotary cutter has a good sharp blade in it. And then you want to pull together 4 fabrics that you like together. And then you're going to take your stack of fabrics and press them so that they lie flat, nice and flat. And also, pressing the stack will help your cotton stay together. And we want to stack first and then cut so that all our pieces are exactly the same size and shape. That's very helpful. You'll see as we go around. So this technique works well on woven fabrics, lightweight woven fabrics, linens and silks. It's wonderful to do with silks and cottons. And it also works nicely if you work with paper, because this way of working, you don't have to sew anything, you just glue them down. So to get started, we're going to be making these units. And what we'll learn from making these units is how to tell where to start and stop sewing, and also how to sew a curve. So to get started, we're going to demonstrate the premise that I said about all of free cut piecing is based on the premise that any 2 edges that match each other can be sewn together and still lie flat. So I'm going to cut a rectangle first to demonstrate that. And I recut because you really want everything the same size and shape to start out with. It can be just about any size and shape, but and then I'm going to cut a gentle curve in here. And you can cut radical curves, but gentle curves are much easier to sew. And in the quilt world, we're so used to seeing perfectly straight lines that even slight curves are very noticeable. And I love the curves in my work because I think they're very graceful. So I've got my pieces cut and I'm going to do some switching here. One thing I forgot to tell you, when you are choosing your 4 fabrics to work with in this, choose half of them solids, because when you're piecing, you want to have good contrast so that your piecing shows up. All right, a wonderful thing about sewing all the way across a square or a rectangle is there's no question about where to start and stop sewing. We're going to start and stop sewing right at the edge. And you can see these, I switched these, but the curves match each other. And I'm going to take my piece and flip the top piece over so it's right sides together, and run this over to the sewing machine. Now, whenever there's curves involved, you want to sew with less than a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And the tighter your curves and the smaller your work, the smaller the seam allowance you want, close to 1/8 of an inch. So if you have a 1/4 inch foot on your machine, this is probably not the best place to use it because we don't want a 1/4 inch. And the other thing is, if you have the capability to use a straight stitch throat plate and a straight stitch foot, it makes the whole process even easier. And needle down, if your machine has it, is another great blessing with this. So I'm going to scooch this under the machine and drop my needle in. Now, one thing that helps beginning students until you learn how to, we know that this should end at about here. So one thing that could help you when you're starting out is to get a pin in the bottom. Otherwise, you just hold on tight. And like Kathy Schmidt says, just sew slowly and keep the edges together, and everything will work out. And she's right. those threads out of the way before you start, obviously. If you have to pick up your foot and readjust, do it, but usually you won't need to. Different fabrics behave differently. Silk that is really stretchy is a dream to do with this. Batiks are harder because they're tightly woven. The reason we want that really narrow seam allowance is because we don't want to have to do any clipping. So when you're done sewing, especially when you're trying out new shapes to you, it's helpful to run over to the ironing board and press this out to make sure it's lying flat. But I know from experience that this will lie flat. So you can stop the video for now and run and finish sewing these pieces. And these pieces are very likely to end up in your finished piece. So don't be afraid to use your good fabric for this. So for our next exercise, we're going to make quarter circle blocks. Now technically, any shapes that I cut into here can be sewn back together, but I really like people to start out with this quarter circle block because you'll see how to sew curves by Karen Stone's Zen of Curve piecing technique. And you'll learn how to start and stop sewing when you're not sewing straight across a rectangle or square. We're going to go to adjacent corners, and that changes things. So lay your pieces out, and I'm using an 8.5 inch square. You can work larger or smaller, but this is a good size to begin with. And again, I'm trimming all around this because I want to start out with everybody the same size and shape. Now, if I wanted to, I could make a paper template, a number of paper templates, if I wanted every circle in my quilt to be the same, but I usually don't. I like the variation. I like everything to be a little bit different. When you're cutting your curves in here, don't cut really deep curves because they're harder to piece. They're interesting and you can do it, but they're harder. So think about cutting gentle curves. And when you're cutting, you never want your fingers in front of your blade. So you can start your cut, put your fingers behind the blade, and then finish your cut. Okay, now I'm just going to mix and match these on top of the stack for now. You can separate them all and design them, but I usually just go for it. Now, one thing to notice about this, I didn't say this, but because I've got 4 pieces of fabric, I'm going to get 4 blocks. And because I did 3 cuts, I'm getting 4 different pieces to piece back together, and there'll be no repeats in the blocks if all goes well. Okay, so to get started here, when I first started, I would put hatch marks across all these so I knew where these to meet up. But with this particular block, you don't need to do that. What you can do is, I have these all lined up here nicely. What I can do is just grab this top piece and put it against there. And put a pin in here. This is the Karen Stone Zen of Curve piecing technique. Now I'm going to hold this out in my hand and just gently massage these edges. And I'm going to have about that much of that bottom piece sticking out. and that's to be expected. Then I'm going to run and get this under the machine. Sink your needle in. And as Karen says, your goal here is to get to the pin without any bumps or tucks. And if you can see that, you can see that I can look and see that I can do that. And I'm going to sew with my less than 1/4 of an inch seam to that pin. Sink your needle in. And then I'm going to repeat down here. And when you're first starting out, students sometimes have trouble with their machines, especially on this. This is the most tight curve in this block. But students have trouble with the machine dragging the bottom layer through faster than the top layer. So it's sometimes helpful, until you get the hang of holding on to this, to stick a pin in there too. And then we're going to repeat and get to the other pin. And then again, if this is a new shape to you, run this over to the ironing board and press it flat. Now, curvy piecing is never going to be as flat as all straight seams, but it's definitely flat enough. You don't want potato chips. You don't want to be sewing potato chips. I can see that this is going to be flat enough. Now, another technique that Betty Ives shared with me, if you're unsure, move this here. Oh, here, I might just go here. If you would like some guidance on how much of this should stick out at the edges, one thing you can do is to lay your pieces out again so that all the edges are matched up, and then scooch the piece you're going to sew on over that other piece about the seam allowance. And so looking at that, oops, here, sorry. Looking at that, you can see, oh, okay, I can eyeball, I can expect that. This amount that sticks out is different on every block because the curves are different, your fabric's different, but it gives you an idea. And the other thing I wanted to show you is, once you figure out where this should be here and get your pin in there, you can sew these pieces together either with your convex piece on top or this way. But it's much easier if you put that stretchy convex edge on the top. So I just get in the habit of doing that because it's easier. Okay, so I'm holding this out in my hand and I can see that I can get to my pin. Your pin here. Now normally when I'd be sewing all these pieces together, oh, sorry about that, I would be chain piecing. I would be sewing all of these parts together in sequence and then doing the other thing there, because once you see how that edge, how much should be sticking out, you know what to look for and what to expect. And I'm a huge fan of chain piecing because it minimizes little bits of thread all over the place and it's just more efficient. I'm a management accountant by training, so I'm all about efficiency. Besides, I just want to make lots of things. Okay, so I think seeing this, I just keep repeating this and sewing all these pieces on. So I'd like you to finish this up and then come back for part 2, where we're going to be learning how to make sharp points in our blocks. So thank you very much for sharing this with me. Bye. After I finished the original video, I realized that I had forgotten to share a couple of things that are important. One, you might be tempted to grab a ruler and square this up right away, but I'd like to encourage you to wait because we don't exactly know where these units are going to be used, and there's some other options if you leave them a bit wonky like this. The other thing I wanted to emphasize is how much the bias is your friend in free-cut piecing. In precision piecing, you pay a lot of attention to the grain because there's no stretch on the lengthwise grain and a tiny bit of stretch on the straightwise. But in free-cut piecing, as soon as you are off grain at all, your fabric gets a little stretchy, and that's very helpful in this. That means that your seams can be off a little bit, your seam allowances can wobble a bit, and it won't matter. So all you really need to concentrate on when you're free-cut piecing is pressing and seeing if your work lies flat. Okay, see you in part 2. Bye.